company called Ghana Power Generation Company against the government of Ghana of about $130 million. Why? Because there was something called wrongful termination of contract. We'll get into all of that. But before we do, we will take some opening remarks from the Vice Chair of CDD-Ghana's board, Professor Audrey Gajabo, who is joining us via Zoom. So, Prof, if you're ready, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. By saying good afternoon to all of you ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the board, management and staff of CDD Ghana, I'd like to warmly welcome you all to today's roundtable and thank you for honoring our invitation to be a part of this very important discussion. We know that the procurement of goods and services by governments across the world is an important aspect of public administration. Governments rely on these to undertake development projects for their people, be it the construction of roads, hospitals, and schools, or the provision of electricity, water, and medications, etc. In Ghana, it's common to find these days the word procurement being synonymously linked to corruption, and increasingly, another phrase that raises negative connotations is judgment debt. In July this year, the Center for Social Justice, CSJ, released a report which revealed that Ghana lost about 189 billion Ghana cedis to judgment debt between 2000 and 2019. Contractual breaches, government's failure to promptly pay compensation for compulsory land acquisitions, statutory breaches committed by public officials in the course of their official duties were some of the reasons judgment debts were awarded against the state. So could that 1.89 billion have been used to support the purchase of, say, vaccines for Ghanaians? Could it have been used to support the construction of roads and expansion of facilities within the health sector? Could it have been used to support job creation initiatives for the youth? How can we fix these recurring problems which continue to drain the public purse? How can we help in ensuring that agreements are better negotiated in the public interest and that Ghanaians derive maximum benefit from international agreements in the future? What are we not doing right? What can we do better? How can we ensure that citizens get the development they deserve? Ladies and gentlemen, that's why we are here this afternoon. In 2019, which I know is a think tank dedicated to promoting democracy, good governance, and inclusive development, adopted the month of September as its Democracy Month, in line with the commemoration of International Democracy Day, which falls on September 15th, so it's past, but we've adopted the entire month. The theme for each year reflects the topical and relevant issues unfolding within the period. So this year, the theme CDD has chosen is democracy and public accountability. And it was selected because we believe that for our democracy to thrive, accountability should be paramount. The concluding highlight of the Center's Democracy Month celebration, therefore, is today's roundtable. And such roundtable discussions provide the center with the avenue and the space to invite well-informed reflections and conversations on various topics of national interest. Already this year, CDD has held a number of roundtables that have addressed, one, citizens' concerns around the COVID-19 vaccine, the late President Rawlings's contributions to democratic development in the Fourth Republic, how the Eighth Parliament of the Fourth Republic can leverage on its composition for reforms, taxation and accountability in Ghana, the impact of presidential election petitions on Africa's democracy, how to make non-custodial sentencing a part of Ghana's criminal justice system, and youth perspectives on the trouble with Ghana's democracy. So today's discussion is the eighth edition of the year 2021. And the aim is to see how best the state and all other complementary bodies can collaborate to solve the recurring problem of judgment debts and poor international public agreements. I'm happy to see you all here today, and I'm glad to see we have a good mix of both state and non-state actors. It's my hope that at the end of this difficult but must-have conversation, that we're going to have the solutions that will be shared here to move forward to those who have to hear about these solutions, and hopefully that could bring about some change in the status quo. So ladies and gentlemen, once again, thank you all so much for coming. Relax, and I wish you all fruitful deliberations. Thank you.
That Prof is not here with us in person does not mean that we should shortchange her on the applause. Let's do it better for Prof. So we are in very distinguished company this afternoon. The Honorable Deputy Attorney General, Dinah Dapa, is with us here this afternoon, and she will give us some few remarks before we begin. Let's welcome her with a round of applause, please.
Those present and joining us online, friends of the media, ladies and gentlemen. I'm pleased to join you here today for this very important roundtable discussion on the topic confronting the challenges of recurring judgment debts and poor international public agreements. I would like at this moment to convey to you the warm greetings of the Honorable Attorney General and Minister for Justice, Honorable. Madam Vice Chair, we can hear you. Right, so I'd like to convey to you the warm greetings of the Honorable Attorney General and Minister for Justice, Honorable Godfrey Dame, who unfortunately could not honor the invitation to be with us this afternoon because of his present engagements outside the country. The issue of judgment debts has made headlines in Ghana for some time now, and the phenomenon, as you'll agree with me, is a disturbing one for our nation. And even more worrying is the fact that there seems to be no end in sight. The recurrent issue has brought a lot of heat to our ministry, the Attorney General's office, as the principal legal advisors and the legal representatives of the states, in the face of recent spike in sums of judgment debts which Ghana has been slapped with. And so we welcome this platform and many others to discuss and deliberate on the issue and find the best solutions to the matter. Our ministry continues to emphasize our unflinching commitment to advance the most effective and effectual solutions to ensure the judgment debt payable by the state remains at the barest minimum. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, it must, however, be said that over the years, several millions of dollars or Ghana cedis have been paid or are to be paid from state coffers to individuals or states as a result of contractual breaches and untimely abrogation of these contracts. At the risk of sounding like a broken cymbal, I think I'll also reiterate the statistics from the Center for Social Justice, indicating that Ghana paid a total of 1.9 approximately billion in judgment debts over the last two decades. The most recent one, which has generated the public debate, is the recent judgment debt against the government of Ghana and in favor of the Ghana Power Generation Company, GPGC. The ongoing national debates on the topic have touched on concerns in respect of, first of all, who and what are the causes of these judgment debts, the need to prosecute individuals or public officials responsible for causing such financial losses to the state. 3, whether there was a need to terminate these contracts, and if so, whether the applicable law or right procedure was followed. 4, the circumstances under which these debts were paid. And finally, what approach is the state taking to address this problem now and in the near future? Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, without wanting to preempt the rich discussions that I foresee coming, permit me to speak on some few factors that have played a role in the situations that have resulted in judgment debts. The first is governance and political leadership driven by self-interest. Ladies and gentlemen, public officials in this country have in some cases failed to put the interests of the nation above theirs and have thereby failed to be mindful of abusing their powers and protecting the public purse. As a result, some of these contracts reveal in most instances the due diligence were not done, there were poor implementation of the projects, timelines were shifted, arbitrary decisions were taken, usually against the advice of the Attorney General, among other things. And clearly, as indicated by the Center for Social Justice, negligence, blatant disregard for public procurement laws, illegal abrogation of contracts, and corrupt activities by public officials in their line of duty have been the primary causes of judgment debts. Then again, I wish to talk about the political blame game. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I cannot gloss over political blame game as a cause of poor international agreements and judgment debts. Admittedly, a consequence of poor governance and political leadership driven by self-interest is the execution of contracts that are not well thought through and have far-reaching consequences in the long term for a successor government. As a result, you would find a successor government seeking to abrogate contracts executed by its predecessor government. Then there's also the issue of merely political blame games resulting in abrogation of contracts for no legitimate reason other than for the politics of it. You will then find a ruling government usually accuse the erstwhile government of the opposition party of entering into agreements not fit for purpose, whilst the opposition party also accuses the ruling party of abrogating workable government and or failing to properly defend the state well enough in arbitration or exercise a better option in resolving the matter. Ladies and gentlemen, the question has often been posed whether it is the case of poor execution of international public agreements or whether the agreements are given the much needed scrutiny before signed by the parties and approved by Parliament. I'd say confidently that the Attorney General's office has competent attorneys to review these documents before they are signed. As the principal legal advisor to the government, the office advises the government through its departments and agencies on these agreements. It is quite often the case, and sadly so, that the AG's office is sometimes not involved in the negotiations and discussions leading up to the execution of these poor agreements. In quite some instances, I'm afraid to say that the opinion of the office is not sought prior to execution, or the agreements are executed irrespective of the reservations raised by the office. Ladies and gentlemen, more often than not, and this is evidence of how things have played out, the issues that take us to the courtroom or before arbitral tribunal has to do with the abrupt abrogation of these agreements or the contractual breaches. Defending the public purse in a situation where there is little to no information or support coming from the institution or ministry involved also poses a great challenge to us. We at the Office of the Attorney General do not exist as a state machinery with a magical wand to wipe away contractual breaches or the judgment debts after they have occurred. We may have our very rare shortcomings indeed in meeting some procedural obligations in international arbitration proceedings. However, it is most often than not that it boils down to our office being handicapped because the institutions involved are not forthcoming with the information required to defend the state. I must say that in these situations, not even the highest fidelity and procedural compliance can absolve us from the realities of a bad case as the merit of the case is determined. Madam Vice Board Chair, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, the execution of poor international agreements, the payment of huge judgment debts, and the recurrence of these phenomena by government is no doubt a major threat to our national development. A holistic look at sustainable ways of dealing with judgment debts devoid of political games is needed. Some people have advocated for legislation to limit the amount in damages contractors and governments can claim in the event of default or breach of a public sector contract. That government contracts should have clauses that limit damages in case of default, breach of contract, or litigation. Some also clamor for the formulation of a judgment debt management policy and a register of all government contracts to be reviewed before they are executed. It is our hope that the outcome of this roundtable discussion will provide an important resource for us as a country in addressing the issues. I am very confident that the outcome of our deliberations here, steered by the rich panelists who have a wealth of experience here today, will have far-reaching impact on our disposition as a democratic state. And so finally, I urge all of us to be blunt with ourselves and interrogate thoroughly the causes of these poor international agreements and judgment debts. I look forward to the rich discussions this roundtable discussion promises to afford us a panacea to these raging challenges. It is therefore with pleasure that on behalf of the Honorable Attorney General, I thank you for convening all this important roundtable discussion to discuss these important issues. I wish you all fruitful deliberations, and I thank you for your kind attention.
One more time, let's put our hands together for the Deputy Attorney General for her remarks. We will be getting into the conversation pretty shortly, but I would like to acknowledge a few of our friends who've joined us. The Honorable Minister for Information, Kojo Ponkrama, is here. Please give us a wave. Yeah. Thank you very much for making time to join us. So I'll hand over the microphone to Dr. Asante, who's going to be our moderator for this afternoon, to introduce to you our panelists, and then we can begin. Dr. Asante.
Get the setup. I think you can move the... Is that okay for YouTube? All right. Okay. Thank you. All right. I'll sit next to you. I think you've made my task easier because you already touched on some very important issues that I was going to raise. But let me introduce our panelists. And to be fair, I wish I was just in the audience listening to these great minds, but still have to do their job. So let me first introduce those of our panelists on Zoom who are joining us. First, Mrs. Clara Kasati, is an academic, a consultant, and a private legal practitioner. She's always a guest on various national current affairs media programs, a lecturer at the University of Ghana Law School, and head of the Chambers of Casa Law Firm. Madam Clarity, are you on? Can you say a few words and so we know that your Zoom mic is working?
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Santi. My Zoom is working. And thank you very much to the audience. Thank you very much, the Honorable Deputy Attorney General, for being able to join us today.
And a board member of the CDD board, so I think it's important to mention that. Next is Dr. Ohianku Kwapon, who is founder and managing partner of the Songhai Group, a corporate development company, and of the Practice School, which is a management program focused on developing senior managers for African countries. He's also a Democracy and Development Fellow at CDD-Ghana. And I think it's important to also share with you his other credentials, because I think it will be useful for this conversation. So he spent several years on Wall Street, becoming in recent past the COO for the Royal Bank of Scotland's global credit business. He was also senior vice president of the New York City Economic Development Corporation, where he oversaw the restructuring of the organization under then Mayor Bloomberg. And he's been on various, he's played various roles internationally. So I think he brings a wealth of experience, particularly in a lot of these development agreements and financing processes, and I'm really happy that he's able to join us also on short notice. So Dr. Kwapon, you're very welcome. We're happy to have you. If you can say something so we can confirm your mic is working.
I'm happy to be here. I've had the pleasure of actually working with the Ministry of Finance, legal people, and also the Attorney General's office on several different contracts and agreements. So that is why I'm actually happy to be here to offer some insights and some of the challenges that I have come across. So thank you. Hopefully you can hear me and the mic is working.
Yes, very clearly. The mic is working. So let me move on to Mr. Graham. Dr. Yao Graham is coordinator of Third World Network Africa, which is a Pan-African research and advocacy organization based in Accra. TWN Africa covers the areas of economic policy, international trade, investment, and the role of the IFIs on African development, gender, economic policy, and Africa extractive sector. So Dr. Graham also has been active in a lot of these agreements, mostly representing often civil society's perspective on some of these international, particularly in the extractive sector. So we're really happy to have you join us, Dr. Graham, if you can give a wave so everybody knows. All right. Yes, they will all move to sit very soon. And then lastly, let me also, actually before that, let me also welcome Mr. David Ofosu-Dorte, who is senior partner of AB and David Africa. He's worked in both the public and private sector for a period spanning 25 years, has immense transaction experience and led several assignments, and his experience in handling high-end projects and financing. Actually, we were just chatting before, and he was giving us a list of the projects that he's worked on. So I think this, just really great to have you, Mr. Ofosu-Dorte, and you're also very welcome. And lastly, and not the least, Professor Kwesi Prempeh, Executive Director of CDD-Ghana. I would reserve his CV and share it later to everybody else. But Prof, I think if those who are here, if you can take your seat. Yes, Mr. Ofosu-Dorte and Dr. Graham can share, and then Prof, you can join us here. Or you don't want to sit next to me? So I want to just start this conversation. I would start off first with those who are here with us physically. I think we need to get a shared sense of what is a good deal and what is a bad deal. Because often, sometimes when the conversation is going on, it's very, very difficult to understand why this particular deal is so bad for Ghana or is good for Ghana. So just, I mean, it's a simple question, but it can be complex. And you can use examples to explain to us why a deal is bad or a deal is good. Mr. Fuzote, maybe since you have a tall list of agreements that you have done.
That's in somehow I would describe a good or a bad deal.
And just an example of what, I mean, there's many deals that we've been in the public sphere been complaining about. PDS, Ameri, the Goldfields Development Agreements. I mean, why is any of those deals bad? Or you a good example?
I'm yet to come across a deal that is bad per se. It is a question of how it's executed. And for clarity, there are 5 stages in any deal that involves the public. First is the planning stage of the deal, and these can align to how the deal is procured. Remember, when the government wants to enter into an agreement with any entity, it must go through a certain process. So the planning stage, at that time, you could be doing the bad things which will lead to trouble. Then you have the preparation in terms of the document preparation stage. That's putting together the document that will lead to the deal. Again, at that stage, you can create all the grounds that will lead to a bad deal or a good deal. Then you have the situation of the selection and implementation. Very often at that stage, a lot of problems occur because the selection stage, mainly you find that we jump what is otherwise technical and commercial issues and superimpose on it political issues. So it leads to the problem being created at that stage. And then you have the stage of where the contract itself being administered. And if there is one place we have very horrible, how should I call it? We lack expertise, or we've created a very horrible system. It is contract administration. Indeed, a lot of the problems occur even in good deals being administered badly. And I don't want to pick on any specific ones, because any good deal can be turned into a very horrible deal if you don't administer it very well. And then you have the decision-making stage, which can even make what is an otherwise bad deal even worse. Yeah.
So, I mean, because when you use the word execution, I thought you were talking about just the implementation of the contract. But from what you described, it's the whole value chain of preparing the agreements, and all that. Okay, thank you very much. Doc, I mean, do you share what Fuzulote has talked about, or anything you want to add in terms of what is a bad deal and what's a good deal?
Yeah.
Okay, so let me deal with Dr. Graham. There are too many doctors. Okay. Yeah.
I mean, my entry point, I agree with Mr. Fuzudote's points, but my entry point on this is quite specific. I mean, my experience is in the extractive sector. And I think the starting point of deciding what is good or bad is slightly different, in the sense that we have a regulatory regime and a policy framework for the benefits that our country ought to get from minerals. Minerals are publicly owned to be developed for the beneficial enjoyment of the Ghanaian people. So that framework is the overarching starting point for evaluating what is a good or bad deal. These are non-renewable resources, and therefore how much value we squeeze for ourselves, whether fiscal, jobs, local development, industries, and so on, represents, again, a set of criteria for evaluating it. So, and then there's a specific legal regime which guides the sector. Again, how much, so that's an evaluative yardstick again, you can use. But then you come to some of the issues that Mr. Fosu-Dortey identified. They are generic. Institutional capacity for overseeing the implementation of even the greatest, value systems and principles is quite important. So then you might get a certain quality of contracts even within that framework or not. And then, of course, the oversight of implementation, particularly in the extractive sector where you need a whole range of capacities to evaluate benefit, not simply the monies you get, but the negative externalities.
Yeah, I think
social
they want us to bring our mic closer to.
Okay. Well, so then they are, because at times in the extractive sector, because of a focus on fiscal, I'm talking about monetary returns to the state, there are many social and economic externalities in terms of impacts, which are even more expensive than the revenue, which don't get calculated. Then there are a whole range of other potential economic benefits beyond public revenue, which tend to be neglected because of a focus on public revenue. So what I'm saying, the universe of discussing good or bad extractive contracts has some specific dimensions. But at the same time, some of the institutional and technical issues that Mr. Fosu-Dortey, spoke about are also applicable.
Dr. Kwapong, I wanted to come to you because I just made a point about extractives. And when you hear about bad deals, they tend to happen either there's some controversy over an oil deal, energy deal, some mining deal. Is that your experience as well? Are there particular sectors that are particularly vulnerable to having bad deals, in your experience?
Deal. We cannot define a bad deal in terms of what we think of it after we find out the things that we don't like and whatnot. To me, if you're going to do any contract with anyone, the first thing you have to determine is what is the objective that you're trying to accomplish, number one. And then number two, what are the inherent risks and whether you've actually taken those risks into account. And then number three, the pricing of those risks, which will determine money flows in the contract. So if you have an objective and you then take that objective to legal, to attorney general, and you get the folks in the room who are actually well-versed in the risk that involved, and you craft a contract that actually achieves that objective for the participants, then that is a good deal. Now, if that contract gets into the public domain and the public assesses it as they don't like it, that does not mean that it's a bad deal. It was crafted to achieve the objective for which its sponsors wanted it to achieve. So that really then comes down to you could have a bad deal. Either you have a sponsor who has an intent that basically the public doesn't like and then achieves it, and then we all get upset. But from my experience, the initial objectives needs to be clear. Crafting of the contract itself, from my experience, later on we can get into it, working with the Attorney General's office and working with the legal folks in Ministry of Finance, there are gaps. For example, usually there's not a whole lot of engagement with private sector lawyers and private sector expertise because the process itself is very chaotic, right? So after this whole thing is crafted, if you send it to the Attorney General's office and they work on it, and for instance, there are risks that you do not have people at the Attorney General's office who are actually have seen pricing of corporate options and things like that before, then guess what? You will not achieve the objectives, and whatever you come up with will fall short. So I think the idea of a bad deal for me starts with, is this a deal that achieves the objectives for which its sponsors actually intended for it to achieve? If it is, then fine. Then we have to then put it in the public domain and say, okay, now why did these objectives began, even was placed as a central objective to be achieved in the first place? Then to me, that's where then the public policy issues then come up. So bad deals usually are just, for me, is just deals that basically do not achieve the objectives for which the sponsors wanted it to achieve. Simple as that.
Let me push you a bit on that. I mean, certainly there has to be an assumption that the objective, at least because we are talking about public international agreements, and we're talking about the state, that the objectives must pursue a public interest. Because if you're, so I hope that there's a certain assumption that underline your statement, because otherwise it will mean that if a group of people who want to benefit set an objective and the AG endorses it, then that will be a good deal, which would be, okay.
I'm glad you asked that question, because I want actually to point us to this whole idea of parochial interest, right? So what happens is that these objectives either has to be the interest of the public, but what happens is that a lot of parochial interest does capture those objectives, and hence the result being bad deals, right? So this is why I think we have to carefully look at the sponsors, the interest, and whether it aligns with the public and whatnot, before we even go to the fact that can the legal actually capture the contract in a way that literally doesn't screw up the contracts further.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Capone.
Clara, I wanted to shift the conversation a little bit to ask why is this issue a persistent problem? I mean, some of the things that come out sometimes is so egregious. You know that nobody with their own private company would never attempt doing that. I mean, the negligence around it is just, so mind-boggling that it is quite strange. And I wanted to just refer to something and sort of get your comment about what exactly is the problem. What really is going on. I think I hear the Deputy AG talk about systemic issues. Mr. Fosu-Dorte has repeated that. And then, Yao has also sort of talked about how state capacity and so on. But I'm just reading this from Professor Akila Fasoya, who I can say is not a panelist here, but in terms of this conversation and the interest, he and Nana Dr. SKB Asante have been really concerned about this issue and have been, writing about it. He refers to this two development agreements that were, Prof, you are online, right? This is, okay, so let me just read this from this was a public lecture that he gave at the University of Cape Coast, and he was referring to two agreements, development agreements between Goldfields and the state of Ghana on the Damai and the Abosu mines. So these agreements were signed on the 11th of March, 2016, tabled in Parliament on the 16th of March for ratification, as required by Article 181 of the Constitution. That same day, the full House referred the agreements to the Parliamentary Select Committee on Mines and Energy for consideration and reporting back in accordance with the standing orders of Parliament. The Select Committee in turn reported back to the full House the following day, 17th March. The House voted to proceed immediately with the motion, having waived the standing order requirement for a 48-hour wait before tabling and consideration of any motion to approve such a report. The report of the Select Committee was tabled for discussion at 9:30 p.m. that day, And the motion to ratify the agreement was passed at 9:40 p.m., 10 minutes later. And I'm sure you can recount several, some with pages, I don't know, 100, 200, 300 pages of text. So this is just to give you, I don't think anybody in the private sector who is dealing with a deal like this would treat it if it required a board to approve it. We'll treat it the way that we treat these international agreements. So Clara, why do we keep doing these things to ourselves?
Thank you very much, Dr. Santi. Directly to your question, I have a few additions to make on the submissions about what a good deal is. I agree with everything that the panelists have said. What I have to add is just that I always say that a good deal, particularly if you're the government official tasked with the main person of solving the country's problems, a good deal is first that you decide exactly what you want out of the deal. Then after deciding exactly what you want out of the deal, then you decide what you can part with and what you are not willing to part with. So you know from the very beginning that this is what I'm prepared to give away, and beyond this, I will not give away. So if I'm being asked to give more than this away, I will walk away. So you have from the very onset what you are prepared to deal with and when you are prepared to leave the negotiating table, because whatever is being offered to you above that is not what you want. After you have made this determination, all the experts and consultants, their job now is to help you to get what you want. And if you don't get what you want, you walk away. But if you don't set out this at the beginning, and then you leave it more to, okay, let's see what you want, and more or less along the line, you are probably not going to get what you want. But yes, I agree with Mr. Dote. For a lawyer, when you say what is a good deal, it depends on who is paying. But as we are talking about the country, the long and short of it is that before you engage consultants and experts to help you decide on how you want to achieve what you want to achieve, it is your primary responsibility to have decided from the very beginning, with, of course, the benefit of research, exactly what you want. And you should be prepared to walk away if you don't get exactly what you want. Whether what you want or what you don't want is reasonable or not will be dependent on the strength of the research that you have done before coming to that conclusion. And then, of course, you must have options. If I don't get this, what is my next step? So you have all your options drawn before you go to the negotiating table. But if you go to the negotiating table without these steps already determined, the chances that you may make concessions that you otherwise aren't compelled to make are very high. Now, that said, when it comes to the issues why we've been struggling with issues of bad deals and all of that, I think it's very simple. It's because the people tasked with doing these deals can get away with whatever. Nobody is held accountable largely to what happens. And so, yes, there's nothing to lose, of course. And we also know the other reasons. The reports we are getting as well from other regulators is that there are issues of bribery concern, that there are times that some of the officials involved are bribed. And when I'm talking about officials, it's not just the politicians, because it's not just the politicians who are involved in these deals. Sometimes it includes civil servants and public servants. So largely, yes, the issue of bribery, we can't run away from it. And then the larger issue, which is just that, I mean, there's nothing to, personally for the persons involved, there's not much to lose. And there are no consequences for doing that. So those are the issues. When it comes to this system, and then the other issues, it's sad because when it comes to particularly international agreements, because of our constitution, at least we have some kind of, at least we have a certain legal framework that is supposed to provide some checks and balances. One of those ones is parliamentary oversight. So we have Parliament that is supposed to check on these transactions to ensure that we have value for money, or that the transactions entered into would benefit the country, which is a good thing, because I always take the position that we are all human beings. I am not of the view that it is just the politicians and the civil servants and public servants who are evil people. No, we are all human beings, and we do what we can get away with and what there are no consequences to. When it comes to the issue of parliamentary oversight, yes. So when it comes to the executive, which generally is the body that enters into the agreement, we can make room for all kinds of scenarios. Even where there is no bribery, it's possible for there to be blackmail. Those are all chances. So it makes good sense that the Constitution provides for Parliament to ratify any such agreements. But then when it comes to Parliament ratifying such agreements, let's come back to the real issues then, which is, one, does Parliament really have the expertise to review thoroughly in an expert manner these transactions? Two, do all these transactions go to Parliament? If you take a typical international agreement, it's usually not just the transaction agreements. There are usually several other agreements that come with the transaction. So the transaction usually is not just the transaction agreement. We need to be finding out exactly what goes to Parliament for ratification. Is it just the transaction agreement, which is more or less, I call it a framework? The devil is in the details. All the other agreements that usually are not talked about, that is where the details are. And so usually if you are looking at the transaction agreement, you wouldn't see. So sometimes it's not necessarily malice. You wouldn't see that if you do A, there is some other agreement that triggers a certain provision, that triggers certain consequences on you. So in short, does Parliament get a full complement of all the transaction documents? And do we have a judicial precedent that should ensure that in the case where the full complement of the transaction documents do not come to Parliament, the particular ones that do not come to Parliament, for example, should they be binding on us, or should they not be binding on us? So there is that issue. And I don't want to take much of the time, but there is so much I can say about the parliamentary oversight, in the sense that I've always said that if you look at the history of our parliament and the legislature generally, how it has come to be, through no fault of DS, Parliament started as a handmaid. If you look at the colonial regime, for example, the role of Parliament was just that of a mere handmaid. And when I say a mere handmaid, it was just a mistress of the executive, in the sense that Parliament existed to allow the executive to be able to use legal instruments to achieve what it wanted to achieve. Parliament was not intended in the colonial regime to be a check on the executive. It was just a handmaid of the executive. We would get independence, and of course we know our checkered history. We had a one-party state at a point after independence, and of course we know what that means in terms of Parliament. The role wouldn't have been too different from that of a handmaid. I start to fast forward. When it comes to the Fourth Republic, we had a real chance of Parliament being an effective instrument of oversight. So if you look at the Fourth Republican Constitution, that is the 1992 Constitution that we have, you can see that Parliament was intended to be able to, among other things, hold the executive in check, and not just that, be the protector of the public purse. But if you look at the composition of Parliament and the resources of Parliament that we have, really, do they have that kind of expertise and resource to be able to be the protector of the public purse that the 1992 Constitution intended them to be? What is the strength, the average parliamentarian, what is the strength of their staff? So if you take the average parliamentarian,
Honorable could do about some of those
agreements he's been reviewing. when he gets to Parliament. But I wanted to get some perspectives from Professor Prempeh. You know, a lot has been said about the executive side. I'm just wondering, how critical is this parliamentary process? So let's say that the deal is bad, it's been conceived badly, all of those things. You're hoping that when it gets to Parliament, somebody might see something and say, no, this cannot go through. But here, as Clara is saying, the capacity, if the capacity is bad in the executive, that may have more resources than Parliament, then are we just asking too much of Parliament in this case? But, you know,
Okay, so it appears that everybody's favorite question is the good deal, bad deal question. It's an easier exam question for all of us, so why are you asking me a more difficult one? But I think that, I mean, let me start by saying, look, deals are, say, unlike litigation, right, which usually almost of necessity will produce a zero-sum outcome because one person's victory comes at the expense of the other party, right? You can't have two of them both winning. One must lose, one must win. Deals can be mutually beneficial, right? Often, in fact, are conceived to be mutually beneficial so that you and the counterparty, you both walk away feeling you have achieved your goals, you've actually exchanged value for value, right? So for me, a bad deal is that deal where one party, in this case, say the sovereign party, Ghana, exchanges substantially more, right, and gets something much less in return, you know, and the other party walks away with, you know, the huge chunk of the deal. The quintessential bad deal, in my view, and I think this is a good, strange but a very good analogy, is the deal that Esau made with Jacob, right, where Esau trades his birthright for a mess of pottage, right? And when you ask yourself, how did that happen? How did it happen that Esau trades his birthright for a mess of pottage? One is about, you know, the state in which Esau was when he made that deal. He was famished, needed food, just self-gratification right away, right? And was willing to trade the long view, the long term, for immediate satisfaction. I think Dr. Graham has mentioned why we get into some of these deals. We're looking only for some fiscal, some revenue flows immediately to balance budgets and other things. And we forget oftentimes about all of the other big things, much bigger things actually, that if we had paid more attention to, we would know that there's actually a lot more at stake here than just getting some revenue flow to balance your budget. So we are Esau's in that respect. Then what also did Esau do in this instance? So he went into this in haste. And you have enumerated many of the things we do with these contracts. Esau wanted the thing so quickly, he was so famished, he needed food so immediately that he didn't think about anything else. So the process, what was the process like? He wanted it right away. When you are making deals for the country and you go into it in crisis mode, in desperation, you need the money right away. You have to balance the budget. You're going to get into an Esau situation in a world where the Jacobs are actually on the other side. And then, of course, the process too. So you do it in haste. You compound your initial error, initial mistake, by actually even doing it in haste. So the process is completely flawed. Why should we actually do any international agreement at all under so-called certificate of urgency? It strikes me as completely bizarre. It should never happen. In my view, the standing orders of parliament should preclude that. Absolutely no approval of an international agreement on the basis of a certificate of urgency. It shouldn't happen, right? But that's what we do. And I think it's also the idea that we have seen this as ratification.
sometimes also worries me, right? Because then it means that it comes after the fact. Sure, of course, you can't negotiate a deal by committee. I mean, in terms of the whole parliament cannot go to negotiate a deal with the other side. So of necessity, the government, i.e. the executive, a smaller team, must be the one to lead it. But when you do that, you expend a lot of resources negotiating this thing, and you bring it to Parliament at the tail end. You bring Parliament in at the tail end. And you think all they have to do is ratify. And, you know, when you tell a lawyer your job is just to ratify, the sense they get is, this is a done deal. You just have to disclose to us all the material facts of the deal, and then we will, almost like we will authorize you to do something you did almost without authority. That kind of perception that is created, that Parliament's role is just to basically affirm, approve, right? And also, I think the way into that, the sense that a lot has gone under the bridge already, so if they disapprove, what is that going to be like, right? So Parliament, for me, comes in a little too late. Right? And then it's just rushed as well. Many of my co-panelists have made mention of the process. For me, I think, you know, a bad deal is a deal that is the outcome of a very defective process. Something you haven't thought through well, you've rushed it. A deal has many facets. You probably just considered one small facet of it, the revenue flow maybe. All of the other things you could do with it, you didn't think through it. So I am more interested in the process. And when you review, when you listen to the conversations around judgment, debts, and the like, one thing that comes out clearly is almost the absence of a process, right? It's a very fragmented process, so to speak. Every ministry, every department, state entity appears to do it their own way. Every minister, I mean, the Deputy Attorney General has told us, and I know that to be, of course, true, that some of these things come to the AG, if at all, again, after the fact. And there's a rush to get the AG's imprimatur, on the deal, you know, so there's pressure. So these things are conceived in a very fragmented way by the so-called responsible ministries, and some of them don't even follow these protocols, right? Now, it strikes me as very odd, because when I cast my mind back to the Quality Grain case and Justice Afre's judgment in that case, right? Some of the learning, I find it strange that the learning from that case has not actually changed behavior in terms of how government should go about doing business and how it should not go about doing business. Because in that case, there were clear infractions that led the court to find the various parties, the accused persons, guilty of violating the law on causing financial loss to the state. And one would have thought that in the case like this, where, you know, criminal punishment, penalties have been visited on public officials for doing things a particular way, that the effect of that would be to inform the process, so that we design a process that really, you know, makes sure, at the very least, out of self-interest, public officials would not do it this way. But since Quality Grain, I haven't seen any change in behavior. There's no behavior modification. That case almost appears to have just disappeared, right? And yet, one of the things that led to the conviction of the persons in that case was the fact that they did not procure the opinion of the Attorney General, and just went on freelancing almost, right? And yet we are being told these things happen, and we know they happen oftentimes without even the opinion of the Attorney General being sought, right? And when they are sought, sometimes transactions happen in spite of those opinions rendered by the Attorney General. So when you look at it, we are in a quintessential Esau situation, right? Where not only are we entering the objectives and the goals for which we are, that drive us into these deals, right? As such that we are in a hurry, we are desperate for something. And then on top of that, we completely ignore, you know, process, diligence, all of that, and in haste, rush these things through. You are going to get those kinds. You are going to get an Esau outcome. And the other side is going to walk away with a Jacob result, right? So I do think that there are really deep structural issues, right? Structural issues, some of them become process issues. There are capacity issues, real capacity issues, right? So if you have a deal driven by politicians, now you cannot run away from the fact that politicians must conceive the idea, right? It is part of maybe their plan. The infrastructure, the project that needs to be funded is part of a government plan. So in terms of the policy and the conception, you cannot run away from the politician taking the lead. But once that step is over, the rest of the processes, and I think that again, because we don't have a unitary standard process for how we do these things, we can only look at it anecdotally and see what's happening. When you look through how these processes unfold, it appears that too many political principals and political agents are involved in things for which we should have technocrats and we should have other professionals take the lead. So when the minister is the one not only conceiving the deal and pre-authorizing it because it's in the budget and all of that, but going to find the supplier and going to sit down and negotiate and going to do all of that stuff, you are bound to run into problems, right? Because even when you do that, then the persons who have the expertise, your bureaucrats and your technocrats and other third-party consultants and others, once the minister inserts themselves too deeply into the process, it disables them. They are unable to actually do the checks, the internal checks and balances that, for which they're there. So it may well be that nominally there's some civil servant is involved, some technical person is involved, but once the minister inserts themselves so directly into the process, they just can't do their work. So for me, that is a structural problem. If we are going to have these kinds of deals, yes, the ministers can pre-authorize them and then sit back and be the oversight internally on the executive side. But when you drive it too far, nobody can stop it. Nobody can stop it. So we have a structural problem, we have a process problem, and there are in fact capacity issues, right? So if you are driving this process, and I'm aware of some, one in the mining sector, for example, where the minister drove it so far that, there was just nothing at the end of the day, for even the Attorney General's people to do, right? And I also have noticed that we don't do a lot of these deals from, we know in contracting and deals and stuff like that, that the party that produces the draft on the basis of which the negotiation must take place, right, is often the party with the upper hand. If you negotiate from my draft, if I bring you the draft, and we negotiate from my draft, more likely than not, I am going to get the better part of the deal. I find it a bit surprising that for a sovereign that has been a repeat player in many of these deals, that we don't go into these deals with, say, model agreements, right? I think we have them in the petroleum sector or something. We have a model petroleum agreement or production agreement, one of those things. But for me, it should be a fairly routine thing. We should have, as a sovereign, just a whole lot of model agreements in the areas where we know we are repeat players, we do business in this area regularly. And out of our draft, that model is our draft, we produce the draft. Then when you come, we sit with you and haggle around. Of course, you have to customize it for the particular deal and for the particular counterparty. But to walk into a deal, I'm aware of one particular deal where the other side, we worked from their deal. What surprised me was that this was in the gold sector. And I'm thinking, but we found gold, we've been doing gold since 18-something. How come that we have to go into a development agreement with a multinational company without the benefit of a model agreement that we, the government of Ghana, have drafted, defining what our interest in these things must look like? But we negotiated from their draft. And when you see the outcome, it's clear that we negotiated from their draft. We gave everything away. There wasn't really much left for us, except the Esau thing. We needed some money, some crumbs off the table. So there's a whole lot of stuff. Parliament, even before Parliament comes in, a lot of stuff has gone under the bridge, right? And then you give it to a Parliament that also has technical capacity problems, right? So when you read the literature, when you read some of the advocacy by Dr. SKB Asante and Professor Pasoya, go to that point that, maybe we need some technical independent review process, right? Not only on the executive side, but independently, also on the legislative side, so that before they get it, somebody independently has reviewed it and offered an opinion, said, look, this deal and all the attachments, this is just not the right kind of deal to do. So there's a lot of stuff, I would say.
Okay, I just want to come to the two of you, Yao and Sofusu Dote, because I think the Deputy Attorney General expressed some real concerns, because if the government's chief lawyer doesn't sometimes get, the opportunity to even express an opinion on an international deal, that is a concern. And it means that, the state is very vast. You can talk about the number of agencies and departments and, the number of contracts that people are signing. What is based on your experience, the capacity issues, at least on the executive side, and the process issues that we have to, examine? What can we really do about that? And then, I think you are the political economist. How do you really structure the incentives within the executive system for people to think twice and say, I am not going to push this, in spite of the fact that minister is called a railroading, or, I've gotten a call from the vice president's office or the president's office or wherever it is that somebody has power. What can we do about that?
I think, let me, as it were, shift the compass a bit. I think we shouldn't be making the mistake of thinking that just because the Attorney General's office writes an opinion, it makes the deal necessarily good, or that it will prevent judgment debt. In fact, with over 2.5 decades, and I worked in the public sector for 12 years before moving to the private sector, I don't think I can count more than 3 opinions from the Attorney General I've seen, which are bad. The opinions are very good. The other point I want to make is that the impression is being created that Parliament is just railroad into approving the deal. That's not necessarily the case, and luckily we have an honorable MP here. If the honorable MP, who is MP for Fwansia Yerebi, and he's also a minister, if he goes to his constituency to make a promise to do, let's say, a road or build a hospital, he takes the agreement to Parliament, and he is part of the people pushing the deal. It's not like he's an independent person holding a very independent, he's part of it. It's not like the 1979 Parliament, where the parliamentarians were not also part of the executive. So there's a constitutional root to the problem regarding, regarding Parliament's role and its ability to look at this independently. That's one other thing we need to. Good deals do not necessarily lead to a situation where we don't make losses. And bad deals don't necessarily lead to judgment debts. At times, the Attorney General has scrutinized the thing from the beginning, giving a clear opinion, but judgment debts still do okay. And in fact, that's the majority of the cases. It's not because the Attorney General doesn't have competence. So I want us to, that's majority of the cases. Because in the course of the implementation of the project, and as Dr. Prempe was saying, the political weight behind it goes through, and I'll give you a couple of real life examples, so you can illustrate. Way back in the 80s, I was on a project and the project is not very far from here, and this is a rural sector project. I'll give you the examples from rural sector. It's very, very common there. Where you are at the site, and this time I was working in the public service, you are at the site with the engineer, and the head of state drives to the site with the contractor early morning. And he drives around. We are having a project meeting. He drives around and speaks to the contractor, and he goes away. And then we've taken a position against the contractor. The contractor comes back at the head of state, giving him a ride. and he's coming to negotiate with you. Tell me, you are in the public service. Really? You're going to negotiate with that contractor? Look, I'll give you another example where in the CP case, it's a case I want everybody to look at. Is the CP case, the quality grade, they illustrate deep knowledge. We don't do case studies in Ghana. The CP case spanned a period of about 20 to 30 years. In 1989, and these judgment debts are not new. In the 80s, they were so prevalent that the PNDC formed what was called the Public Agreements Board, chaired by no less a person than the former, the special prosecutor, Martin Amidu. Why was that board dissolved? Same discussions we are having. That board was dissolved one day by a fiat of the head of state at that time. But you find that the junction between Kolebu and where we call Lavender Hill, the contract was awarded on TV because the president at that time went on an inspection in his car. We all watched it on TV. He gets there. The contractor says, since I have done this road up to the ring road, how don't we continue? Hey, yeah, no, in Ghana or something like that. Yeah. He awarded the contract there. Behind the scenes, we were debating on the rates at which the contractor was using. I've given evidence on this at the Judgement Debt Commission, so this is public knowledge. And I told the Judgement Debt Commission that nobody is going to implement this report, neither NDC nor MPP, because it cuts across both parties. The politics behind it is too heavy for anybody to implement. So when you see a head of state award a contract on TV, and you are a civil servant, or you are the Attorney General, what difference will your opinion make? The thing about civil servants, especially Attorney General, is that they are so careful. They will write the opinion, as we say in Chipepepe. The fault is never traced to the person who is writing the opinion, because the fault is actually from the people pushing it. I'll give you another example. Amekom interchange. Sarok granulate gel fee. The contractor had committed so much offense, including 2.5 million awarded to him, which was never paid to bring the public walkway to the place. Yet, 3 weeks before the contractor terminated, they managed to get the president at that time, President Kufo, to commission the road, getting to elections. If a president is getting to elections and you have to commission a road, they come and tell you, you're a president, you don't know all these things. All the documentation come from all the ministries. Go and commission the road. You will commission the road. It's part of your promise. After the road is commissioned, contractor terminates. By principles of the contract, we civil servants are done properly and Attorney General had cleared. Clearly, we've taken over what we call sectional completion or practical completion. The fault is yours. So the fault is not from Attorney General. The practical things which happen on these things is such that the real technical and commercial issues are sidestepped because the politicians have to deliver a promise by a certain time, and they do not, after making that promise, allow technocrats to work. So we end up creating the problems. Now, it's not a problem with agreement. Look, as for who drafts the agreement and all the rest, yes, he is right. But even if you gave me a draft agreement and it's bad, I will tell you it is bad. The opinions Attorney General has written, but nevertheless, the negotiations go on and the wrong thing is done. I think as a nation, we should simply be looking at, do we want to continue spending money? And I'll go back to the CP case. In the CP case, and the people who were actors in the CP case are known. At some point, you have the 1989 problem settled, and the settlement said they will replace it with 3 agreements and Cape Coast Town roads. Cape Coast Town roads were not defined. The 3 agreements were all prepared on the same day, I think 5th December 1996, sent to Parliament, all approved that same day. Project starts, it gets into arbitration again. At some point, settlement was supposed to be 11 million. We ended up with $200 million. As we speak, there are offenses being created in the ministries on the blind side of Attorney General, which will be the judgment that we will pay 2 years from now. Because the ones we are paying now were created 3 or 4, 5 or 7 years ago. That's the truth of the matter. So as a nation, we just should be bold enough to say that, okay, politicians have to make a decision they want to deliver on their promise. But once they say they are delivering on their promise, they should leave technocrats to use technocratic processes. At the same time, the technocrats must hurry up and speed up or not waste politicians' time. I'm not oblivious to that. There's a balance we need. Otherwise, we will keep going around and going around and going around, and then we won't solve the problem. That's the truth of the matter.
Yeah, I mean, we are not the only country where politicians go and make promises. But I don't think judgment debts and bad agreements are that common in, say, the US. I mean, we always hear politicians also making promises there. other African countries, or I mean, across the world. So what is it? I mean, so I understand the incentive to rush, but why are we getting the short stick all the time from this process? I mean, how do we manage this process? Yeah.
Can I come in?
Oh, you want to come in? Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, you come in, and then yeah, we'll come in. Yeah.
So it's very interesting hearing. So it is obvious that whatever process or structures we have is very chaotic. I've been in the process before, and what I would say is this: the issue of building sort of capacity at the executive, or this or that, that is not something that's sustainable, because there are so many sort of a broad range of issues, from technical pricing and whatnot, that you cannot cover all of it. But what I know is that what Prof said, is very, very true. The process and the structure. So the 3 countries that I have been involved in, or I'll even use this example. I was working in the UK when a company signed an agreement with the government of Ghana. In that, when they came to London for the meeting, when the government representative came to the government for the meeting, there were a lot of MPs who came along. The law group that was representing the company in the UK called me because I manage a technical team, and had me come in to represent on their side. Now, the people that we faced, all coming in from Ghana, I can mention the names, but no need to do that. But what I would say is that they were all MPs and a few other people who were not very knowledgeable. They had their lunch, they had the nicely done lunch and dinners and whatnot. The discussion was all one-sided, and in the end, the agreement was put in front of them. And that is because back in Ghana, what is happening is there is not a process, as Prof said, but even more, unlike places like, New York City, under Mayor Bloomberg, every agreement that was signed by New York City or crafted by any department, there is EDC. EDC is the New York's sort of development corporation, well-staffed with legal people, technical people, subject matter experts. Every agreement goes through that before it gets to the executive. The same thing with US, the OMB. US would never sign any international agreement without it going through OMB, and OMB actually assessing the benefits and the risk before it goes to Treasury, and Treasury actually costs it. Same thing with Denmark. Same thing with the UK. What we are lacking in Ghana is that there's sort of this chaotic, sort of disorganized way where everyone in their own corner thinks of something. And then what happens? Parochial interests take over. And then different people, whether you're a technocrat or whatever, you still also have parochial interests. There is not in our country as an organization or a center, or I would say a COE that basically is charged with actually reviewing contracting agreements and whatnot, much like the OMB in the US, much like the BOE in Denmark, and much like what they have in the UK. So guess what happens? Every agreement, when you have to do it with Ministry of Finance, you go and you sit down with Mangoa, and guess what? She's only one person. And then if you have to deal with Attorney General's office, if someone has to do pricing, guess what? They never call any technical private side pricing guy to come in. You sort of have to educate them and go through this whole almost like hand-to-hand combat, right? Even when it gets to Parliament, I've had things actually go to Parliament and have gotten stuck. And I was told, this was like 5 years ago, I was told to come and sit and convince people. And I'm not an MP, so I think there's a gap in both the process, but before even the process, I think the structure of government itself, where things really get reviewed, is totally missing, right? And that is the best practices that I have seen in other countries that have been very good at actually guarding their agreements. You know.
Thanks for that intervention. So, Yao, if we set up or bring back the Public Agreements Board, would we solve our problem?
Let me take this slightly different. In fact, the discussion, the last intervention talks about a kind of a universe of chaos and independent actors. The extractive sector actually is the one area where we have dedicated institutions and fairly prescriptive regimes with details, together with model frameworks and so on and so forth, which are either explicitly or implicitly defined by some development vision. So you want not only to get oil revenue, but you also want local content, and so on and so forth. You don't simply want to dig your gold, but you also want local development, local content, jobs, and so on and so forth. So the contrast, I think the contrast between the extractive sector and public procurement, because what we're talking about here is primarily the universe of public procurement, as opposed to the area of concessions for accessing our natural resources for us to get revenue. So on the procurement side, we are spending, although we may borrow to spend. On the natural resources side, we are granting concessions to generate benefits, okay? And the regimes are fairly prescriptive. Kwesi, going back to your point about an agreement, we know I know you're talking about the Newmont agreement, okay? The Newmont agreement in 2003 was negotiated in the castle. Lobbyists went to the presidency, moved around, and basically the Minerals Commission had nothing to do with it. Now it's an example of something which is quite prevalent, whether in this extreme form or in kind of different shades of that kind of practice. What I'm saying here is that, so what we have is that even where there's quite a regime with prescription and principles, what we are describing in the public procurement realm is still present. So clearly, there are some things there which are issues also, what I would describe as the culture of power and the function of institutions. Because at times, some of the bad decisions may not even be personally beneficial to the person driving it. It may just be chronoism, and basically we can describe that as a certain kind of a casual abuse of power with grave consequences for the public and the nation. And I think the natural resources sector is particularly important, because if you take the Newmont example, which was an agreement with unconstitutional elements and all kinds of crazy provisions, I met people who were close to the deal on the Newmont side, and they said what Kwesi was talking about, that they brought a draft and were expecting to be a negotiation. And it was by and large just waved through, and they got things which the Minerals Commission commented on, but nobody paid any attention to what the Minerals Commission has to say. And you find that being repeated. So institutions are legally vested with responsibility. They're either bullied or ignored or threatened by politicians. People have been sacked for daring to stand up. Professor Sawyer was chairing a kind of mineral policy review committee in 2016 when the government decided to give certain privileges to goldfields in exchange for completely unclear and unenforceable commitments. He resigned. So this committee, with a long-term public policy benefit potentially, didn't finish its job. This was the peak of the gold price thing. And among the things that were agreed, ironically, in the previous period, that same committee had renegotiated the Newmont agreement to bring it closer to what existed. But it still was not, at that time we had a 5% royalty rate in the law. The Newmont thing had been stabilized for 30 years. and could be applicable to any investment they made and so on. So the agreement, the revision moved it, put it in a band, okay, and brought it closer to the 5% range. It had a knock-on. I'm taking as an example of how one bad policy can actually destroy a system for a variety of reasons which may appear sensible. Now, the Newmont Agreement has effectively destabilized the mineral governance regime of this country. Why am I saying that? From that bad decision, all the other big mining companies began to make demands. That why is Newmont being privileged? Because they had older agreements. And then these guys came, were given something completely off-field. So they said, why do you give these guys this? We too deserve that. It became a source of political pressure on the government. I don't think they need to have given in to it because they were binding contracts. And they could argue, that there were particular reasons and so on, and they're trying to rectify it. But anyway, the Goldfields argument, facilitated, no doubt, by lobbyists, was accepted because they threatened they couldn't make new investments and so on and so forth. So what did the government do? Although the law provided for statutory 5%, Goldfields was given an agreement with a Newmont sliding scale under which they were paying the minimum rate of 3%. If you look at the law, that's an illegality. And we've said this publicly, that time have continued to say, and this illegality was carried over into the Anglo-Gold Ashanti Agreement of 2018. So although we have 5% on the statute book, all these people have been given royalty, a sliding scale. Now, I was looking at the gold prices. The sliding scale provided that you pay 5%, which is a statutory level, in the Goldfields Act if the price got to $2,300. Since 2016, the highest price of gold has been $2,035. So the 5% in the statute is dead. So we are running this regime together with a whole host, of other things. They got a stabilization agreement. Everybody demanded a stabilization agreement. The stabilization agreement now came with all kinds of things where now all kinds of things which normally are not covered by stabilization are being included. So you have a situation where we have a certain loss on the book, but because of one act of casual abuse of power, there's a nominal regime, but in practice, there's nothing. You take the Anglo-Gold Ashanti Agreement, the government projected a revenue of $304 from the first 10 years of the agreement. What did they do? Following what was done with Goldfields and so on, they offered Anglo-Gold Ashanti $275 million kind of a tax exemption. We remember the total revenue in the first 10 years was around $30 million. And this for reopening one of the oldest and most lucrative gold mines in the world, Obuasi. There was no risk involved. And yet all kinds of things were piled up because the preceding agreements contained similar things. So this is just to illustrate the point. And going to parliament and so on, the same kind of thing. And I think corruption, when it gets to a place like parliament, in addition to lack of knowledge, is a major part of it. And also a certain sense of party political loyalty is a major part of it. And then, of course, crony backslapping. Because it's Ghanaians who kind of are the leaders of these organizations. You see, and it gets into a certain kind of vicious loop. Because on one hand, these same companies who don't want to pay any taxes, or very minimal taxes, are the ones who are loudest in saying government should give a lot more revenue to the mining-affected communities. So they are the champions of mining-affected communities for government spending, which they are not ready to contribute to. So we have this universe, a perverse universe around non-renewable resources. And I'm saying this is the thing where we have very prescriptive regimes. The Eka energy thing, which is in controversy now, is an example. So having a prescriptive regime and institutions dedicated, clearly, is not necessarily a guarantee of certain outcomes. And I think the narrow conception of accountability, where politicians and even an institution like Parliament doesn't see the public and kind of citizens' bodies as legitimate actors, is also an important part of it. Because by the time anybody gets to know of agreements simply through the accident of informal access is very far gone. So in addition to the things we are saying, I think very early upstream visibility for pending agreements so that it can become the subject of public discussion for those who are ready to take an interest will itself dynamize the culture of growing public interest and attention, and also paying attention to the question, Kojo, you posed, that what is the public interest benefit? That simple question, as a starting point for every citizen or institution's engagement, will allow us to narrow what is the best outcome, and also to ask questions of institutions and actors, whether public employees or politicians.
All right. Thank you. I want to come to our audience before I take final comments from you. So I'm trying to get something concrete, from this discussion. The Deputy Attorney General is here. Both the Attorney General, yourself have reiterated this concern about, public agreements. You've even proposed ways of limiting damages and so on. And so I know that this is a rare opportunity to get something going. But so far, what I've heard, I'm asking, how do we move this process forward? That this process is dominated by politicians, and that always brings certain incentives that cowers everybody around, technocrats, bureaucrats, and then certainly the outcomes are not good. That even in places like the extractive sector where there are good prescriptions and processes and institutions, we're still having these difficulties. So I'm hoping that the audience, those who have questions, you kind of focus on that area. How do we move the agenda forward from here? Because we certainly have to deal with the hemorrhaging. Dr. Kwapon, I've seen your hand, and when we come back from the audience and we're doing one last round, we'll come back to you. So please hold your thoughts, and we'll come back to you. But now the floor is open. Yes, Mr. Bembuachi from ASEP.
Thank you very much, Kojo, and good afternoon to everyone. Very interesting and revealing contribution on this important topic. But just a little bit from what I have seen in the space, and for judgment debt to occur, it can't be just as a result of a bad or good contract. It's because there's been a judgment. And how do we get to that level where we go to court and get a judgment from that? And I think that is where the problem really emerged. We can discuss all the problems with the contracting issues, parliament processes, but contract management, as Mr. Fosudote really said, is the biggest problem. All right. Businesses are not usually rushing to court. They want to stay and do business. So even when you realize that you have a very bad contract on your hands, how do you mitigate such a terrible contract? How do you manage that contract? It's really the conversation for the state. And how do you eliminate, do away with emotions and incentive to really address the issues that you have? It's the biggest problem that we actually really have. Because I've seen contracts that should be in court, they are not in court. And contracts that shouldn't be in court are in court. All right? I mean, in the power sector, we're talking about GPGC. It's not the worst contract we signed in the Dunso era. We determined, even by a committee, that contracts like AXA should just be cancelled and bear the consequences. But they are here making much more money than any judgment would have given us. But those that were much lower, we went to court and got a judgment, against the state. So if we have a process that helps us to appreciate that once Parliament gives consent to an agreement, that's the highest seal the investor can get. And therefore, how you manage it becomes really, really important. And also the timing of your decisions and your actions. There are contracts that if we acted 2-3 years back, the judgment would have been just little. But we ignore the contract, allow it to mature to a point where when you abrogate the contract, you're going to pay so much. And we still want to abrogate it. All right, so I had the Deputy AG, was coming, I was listening. Maybe somebody has to initiate a process that says, this is how we deal with agreements. And that process has to be exhausted once government has entered into the agreement and hold people accountable as they fail along the chain. Otherwise, you're not always going to get the best even advice from the Attorney General's office. We have seen advice from the office where Attorney General says, don't do it. If you do it, these are the consequences. And they don't do it. There are ones that you also see. They say, go ahead and go to court. Last 10 minutes. We'll go and get a judgment. All right? So if we have a process that actually avoids just canceling or ignoring contracts, that would serve the public interest. And then we can then address the deeper issues about how do we even get into contracts. Why do we get almost every high-value contract spending less than 2-3 days in Parliament? That's a bigger conversation to have. Sometimes the expertise may even be there. But, reading contracts, the second reading even gives you different perspective. Third reading gives you different perspective. How are they able to magically do it within such a short period of time? It's a bigger conversation that we need to have. Parliament itself has rules around how it engages around these agreements that we do sign. And that could be another conversation for us to have. But judgments result, for me, mainly because of how we treat these agreements. We don't sometimes care whether it's a good or bad contract. If I don't like you, I don't want to attend to your contract.
All right.
That is what is resulting in most of the judgment that we are seeing around.
Thank you, Ben. I think Beauty first, and then I'll come to you, sir. Beauty.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. I would like to comment.
Please state your name.
Okay, sorry.
I'm being too informal. Sorry.
My name is Beauty Mefanat. I work with Ghana Anti-Corruption Coalition. So I'd like to commend the AG's office for the admission of the challenges you have with these contracts, because most of the times the blame comes to your office. So that's public admission for me, it's good. But I'm looking for the way forward. How is your office position? I know you are not part of the panel, but we don't get to speak with you every day. So how is your office position to embrace support and help from experts who may not be in government, who may also have some contribution to support your office? And then, Prof, I like the example you use of Esau. In fact, I was going to take the offering for you. Yes, I really like that. But I felt so sad because if I look at Esau's story, by the time we saw him again after his brother was returning, he said he had so much and he didn't even need anything from his brother. So does it mean we have not learned from our mistakes? Are we not learning from the Esau's mistake that he has improved? Why are we still talking about this, when Esau has actually learned and graduated from his mistake and improved in his life? So I don't know how it will be, but I think that this discussion should not end here. We have to find a way of bringing in that practical improvement in the process, because we talked about the process, we talked about the structure. But after here, we'll still hear more of this again. So how do we involve it? And once Honorable Minister is here, I also want to...
The town hall meeting.
I want to take advantage and ask about the access to information, which has also been the challenging to the issue of transparency. We know that state secrets and then some kind of clauses are used to deny us such information. But in other jurisdictions, most of these contracts are made available. So how is your office also helping to make access to information so that from the very onset, we can help? And when civil society is making noise, we are not saying as anti-Ghana, but we are making noise based on the information we have. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. Yes, sir. Please state your name.
My name is Siafa Kamara. I'm the Chief Executive for SEN West Africa. It seems to me that I'm from Liberia, but I live in Ghana for 30 years. It seems to me that every time when we have these discussions about power in Ghana, there's a big elephant in the room, the presidency, and the kind of power that we have given it. I think until we can resolve that, when one person who has in the democracy the main implementing institution, until we can reduce the power of the presidency. Where did they go? The castle. Where are they going now? Jubilee House. It's the presidency. So I think that when we're talking about contracts, procurement, we have to look at the unequal distribution of power in Ghana between and among the three organs of the state. That, for me, is at the heart of what we are talking about. It's not that Ghanaians do not have the expertise, they have it. But I think the way in which we have allocated political power, because it goes with resources. At the end of the day, it is he who decides. It is the presidency. So for me, that is the key. The second point I wanted to make is, you all referred to it. I'm wondering, what role do Ghanaian citizenship has to do with the question of poor execution of contract, judgment debt? Is there something that some of us, we are grassroots people, what can we do to put more pressure? And I think that what we can do to put more pressure is to join the campaign that says, let's distribute power. One person, one office, appointing the number of officers in this country, signing the number of contracts in this country is the problem. Thank you.
I think we are, all right. Ambassador, because you are in-house, I cannot say no. And I'll take yours last, and then we can come to the panel and wrap up.
Ambassador Chegan, just to pick on some of the things that we've talked about this afternoon. One, we talked about having the same objectives with the people who are going to sign the contracts. My experience is that in most cases, the objectives can never collide, can never be the same. Because somebody, in most cases, from my experience, if somebody comes to initiate the process, so right from the beginning, the person has a certain objective. And then we are following the SR case, in most cases. The person has Ghanaians who are close to government. They know what government is thinking about. They know what government wants to do. So they go abroad. Sometimes they lobby actually their governments to give us money. And they know that when the money is given to us, they also have to participate in reaping the benefits. So when they come to Ghana, they know the people that they have to contact. They are driving the process. From the servants to parliament. They are in parliament to talk to the MPs. So right from the beginning, the process can never work to the benefits of the country. You can have all the institutions that we all talked about. Even in the concessions sector, where you are saying that the institutions are there, the prescriptive rules are there, but we know that the people who come in are brought in by some people. So they know where to go. I was in Washington when the new mod thing started. Their first port of call was the embassy. And then they came to Ghana. After that, we never saw them again, because they were able to establish where to go. I was part, in fact, not part, I was the ambassador in Spain when Isophoton issue came. Nobody up to today has talked to me about Isophoton. When at a certain stage, the chief director of Ministry of Finance called me and said that, do you have any Isophoton? I have a letter from the Attorney General saying that we should pay Isophoton some amount of money. I said, no. This man heard that the Spanish government was going to give 60 million euros to Ghana. So he had his contacts in the Spanish ministry and started coming to Ghana, taking civil servants to Spain, all over the place. He spent some money, and in the process signed an MOU with a minister, MOU, not an agreement. And that was the basis for his claim of 1.3 million for Ghana government. So I don't know how we can go about this, but real issues are there. And the national interest is there. But who is there to protect the national interest? It's only us. And some solutions have been given. When do we start hearing about these agreements so that people can get involved? Those are some of the issues that, for me, are very important. But the process and the objectives, we have to, right from the beginning, know what we want to do this. You know, there are Ghanaians all over the world. They go, they know, we want fire tenders. So they talk to investors. We can give you 300 million. We have contacts at Exim Bank. They will give Ghana government guarantee. So they fly and come and present proposals to people in government. And for the politicians, that is a ready way of fulfilling their promise, and then in the process, making money for the party. Yeah, it's a fact, making money for the party. Because a businessman once told me that he will give me 100,000 euros to do something. And I said, I don't have the power. The power is in the presidency. Even the Minister of Finance, the way the thing was being done, he decided that I don't want to have anything to do with it. So the presidency should handle that particular issue. Then he said, you don't want 100 million. If you don't want it, you can get it for your party. I said, I'm a civil servant. I'm a civil servant. I've been in the public service for several years. I don't belong to any particular party. Then he said, I've worked in Ghana for 30-something years. You look like you are not a Ghanaian. You know, so just to give some of the examples of some of these agreements are signed.
Thank you, Ambassador, for your insights. It's past 4, and so I want us to have some closing remarks. I know there were questions that were posed to the Honorable Minister for Information and Deputy Attorney General. They are at liberty to respond or not. Before I go to the panel to wrap up, if you wanted to make a short, yeah.
Thank you. Beauty, perhaps to oversimplify my answer on how we engage, as it were, experts, you know, and generally, it's like here. You know, I think what I can say on authority is that the Aegis Office does not take lightly the engagement with generally the public and experts, private persons on it. And I have empirical evidence to back this assertion. I mean, I have the senior practitioner, legal practitioner like Mr. Ofuzot. I think I heard Dr. Kwapon talk about his engagement with the Office of the Attorney General, of course CDD generally. And so we're very open and receptive to this. And what I find out that the engagements we've had with the public and other experts have inured in some way to some trainings and even workshops for us at the Attorney General. So you're always welcome to engage us on this. And as I said, there is empirical evidence to back this, and Mr. Fosu.Dote and Dr. Kwapon are examples of how we receive and in fact engage experts and the public generally on our undertakings. Thank you.
Yeah, I was not intending to make comments.
That's why
yeah, but since I've been invited, I mean, specifically to the subject of access to information, the access to information regime put in place by the RTI Act is actually working. Over 500 institutions have RTI officers who have been trained and are available to respond to your information requests today if you make a request in accordance with the law. We've had opportunity to prepare an annual report on how it's functioning, laid it before Parliament, met with civil society about it. So it's functioning. And if there are contracts that you would want to get access to, they qualify as material that you know, are not exempt, and you can actually get access to them. Contracts typically, unless maybe they were of a security nature, will not be part of the matters that are generally exempt. So I'd like to encourage you to take advantage of it. But Kojo and to everybody here,
and do add, what kind of contracts do you normally receive? Because like Clara was asking, you know, do you just get like the framework agreements or you get the full?
Yeah, so I'm going to deal with that in my general commentary. I think one of the things we must say from the outright or from the outset is that a lot of progress has been made in closing the space that used to be available for people to maneuver in terms of giving Ghana the short end of the stick, or you know, not managing contracts well to the extent that we end up with these debts. This conversation is in two parts: how to get the best out of deals and how to limit the judgment end. And I think that if we do a dispassionate analysis, let's say over the last 2 decades, as a country, it's not zero now, but we have made a lot of progress in closing the loopholes. Take the Public Procurement Act, take even RTI that we are talking about currently, take what's happened in Parliament with the kind of resources that are being made available to parliamentary committees to do the interrogation of documents, take the Public Financial Management Act and how it is even limiting what you can pay and what you can't pay for. It's not zero, but a lot of progress has been made, and I think that as part of our conversation, it's good that we acknowledge and don't create an impression that nothing's been going on so far. I think specifically, the suggestions are great. One that I'd like to highlight is the fact that there's no single cause of the problem, and therefore there's no single solution to it. And the problem is a problem that is manifested across the value chain in the contract process. So from the inception to the planning to what I call the effectualizing of the contract is, of course, some of these problems are because the contract has not come into effect or has come into effect. Why? Because conditions precedent, fulfilled or not fulfilled. Then you have the execution and sometimes poor monitoring and evaluation. I think, therefore, it's a value chain thing. A few things that I think must happen on the value chain. One is a capacity question. There must be a significant improvement of capacity across the value chain. So from the people conceptualizing the idea to make the political promise out of it in the first place, how are we beefing up the capacity so that people don't end up with promises that they have to fulfill as politicians, which in essence are misconceived? At the planning stage, technical, financial, legal, and I even say policy. Does this policy itself make sense? Make sense to the extent that we are now going to do technical analysis and financial analysis and even invite AG to come and do something about it. And I think across the value chain, from the conceptualization within the executive, within Parliament, even post that, there needs to be some capacity work. I don't share the view that you need an independent group to come and now filter what is going on. No, I think it's about deepening the capacity across the value chain so that you get better value for what is going on there. I also think that our analysis is being a bit too simplistic in assuming that every deal goes to Parliament. It's not true. There is a category
with international agreements.
Absolutely. And I dare say that if somebody takes time to do an analysis of the deals that don't go to Parliament, which end up being bad, as compared to the ones that must go to Parliament, which end up being bad, you may find that we're having a lot more, in terms of the number of deals, you're having a lot more deals that don't fit within the category of deals that must go to Parliament and get some scrutiny, that are having challenges. When I became member of Parliament, I found out the number of assemblies that were in court because of a 3-unit classroom block contract that has been terminated and the contractor is taking them to court, or little events like that. And so the supposition that fixing Parliament fixes everything, I think we must look at it again. And that takes me back to my earlier argument that you therefore need to do, or we need to do a lot of work across the value chain at the assembly level, at the state-owned enterprise level. A lot of the challenges you are having sometimes at the state-owned enterprise level, it's not even a matter in which the sovereign is engaging in an international economic transaction and therefore under Article, I think 181 or so has to come to Parliament. No. This is sometimes SOE level, which the courts have ruled is not exactly the same. This is sometimes at the assembly level. So again, I think it's something we should pay attention to. Parliament is improving, and now I want to deal with the specific matter. Sometimes we cite an example like Ameri. Ameri, with the greatest of respect, if I recall, was not something that was discovered by, let's say, civil society or the media or somebody and stopped. I was in that finance committee meeting of Parliament when it was stopped. It was Parliament that actually took that decision. And that decision, if I dare say, was led by members of the majority side in Parliament. And that goes contrary to the thinking and the narration we like to make that, it's a rubber stamp, everything goes through.
Anyway.
No, go ahead with your question.
No, go ahead. Go ahead, because we are wrapping up.
So I'm not saying Parliament is perfect, but I'm saying that Parliament is improving. A lot of work is being done. I, for example, have the benefit of a research assistant. 2 or even 1 MP ahead of me, my predecessor, did not exactly have that. Today, there's work on getting an office of budget and analysis and other things. So it is improving. And I think that it's important to acknowledge these things and not sweep it under the carpet. There are about 2 types of agreements that come under Article 185 in Parliament. 181.5 and the rest in Parliament. There is sometimes a specific deal, which is a combination of the financial agreement or the commercial agreement and the technical agreement. So you find the drawings and the specifics and then the numbers that come to Parliament. And if you don't have the benefit of expertise in either places because somebody was popular in a constituency and was voted for, and therefore it's on this committee and may not necessarily have the technical or the financial understanding, then you have a challenge there. But I think what needs to happen is more support for committees. These committees must have experts and advisors on these committees so that when people are popular in their area, get elected, come to Parliament, he is not forced to examine a deal that he does not have the competencies to understand. But the committee on which he's serving has the bureaucratic support that can help with that kind of analysis. Then there's the other kind of transaction. So take the Sino-Hydro transaction, take, I think, the $4 billion Chinese agreement under the Mills administration. Those will come as a master facility agreement, which you then give approval to. And then you have specific transactions, as Clara was talking about, that may come. And I agree with the view that it is important for all of those specific transactions to get parliamentary blessing before they come into effect. I think the last thing is that this whole conversation also fits into the bigger subject of the perception of corruption, the perception that the public service is improving or not improving. And my last point there will be that I think we have to do a deeper dive as analysts, as academics, as civil society persons, as media. We have to do a deeper dive. Because sometimes even we, the politicians, do it depending on which side of the divide where we are. Throw some questions about a particular transaction and make it look as though it's technically, financially, legally inaccurate. When indeed, if somebody did a dispassionate analysis, you'd realize that there is nothing wrong with this particular one. Or sometimes not just let it go through because it's coming 48 hours to the thing. And I think I agree with the view that because Parliament is a master of its own rules, Parliament should be able to, in the new standing orders, for example, say that no approval under Article 181 should be given without at least 14 days to examine the kind of documentation with that. So progress is being made. Let's deepen that progress. Thank you.
Okay, so I'll just come to our panelists to react and make their final contributions. As I said, I wanted something concrete from this discussion. There are a few ideas that have been thrown out here. Some are not necessarily new. It's whether or not we can actually implement it. Particularly, how do you get other actors involved in the transaction quite early on? Particularly if you have contract entrepreneurs all around the place in various ministries. As soon as the government comes in, everybody's bringing money or proposals and so on. How do you discipline that process, for instance? I think, the Attorney General office has made it very clear that, there are all these challenges about different entities doing different things, and sometimes they are not even aware. Ben has talked about contract management, and how do you discipline that process? I think Kwesi, even in some earlier on some earlier platforms, you've talked about the AG actually, treating all entities as clients, as a proper law firm that charges other departments for the work they do for government. Because if that is coming out of your vote to that agency, you will not be misusing or sort of not implementing your contracts. Because if you incur all these things, it will come from your budget and not the Attorney General's budget. And that might offer some discipline in some of these units. So all these ideas are there, and I just want to hear sort of your final sort of takeaway proposal, so that we can, we aim to put together some sort of a documentation from this discussion, so that it can be, a conversation starter on how we move forward these proposals. So I'm going to start with Clara, because Clara, once you spoke, I didn't come back to you, so I want to start with you, and you begin, and your final thoughts, and then we'll come to Dr. Kwapong before then we take our panelists here. Got it.
Thank you very much, Dr. I agree largely with what the Information Minister just said. What I want to add is, when it comes to expertise in particular, and capacity, I actually do not believe, believe that the executive, for example, lacks capacity and expertise. I think that the perception of expertise or a capacity missing from the executive is an artificial one. The other ones may lack it, but not the executive. And I say so because the executive has the benefit of the entire public service and the entire civil service, all of who have technocrats that they can fall on. There's also the general public, the private sector consultants that the executive can fall on. So the executive doesn't lack expertise and capacity when it comes to that. And largely, I agree that it's a value chain issue. And just to come, the issue that we seem not to really want to, it's difficult to admit, I must say. Let's take the example of one of the situations. If you look at the judgment debt report, for example, what occasioned the judgment debt? a writ was issued, a statement of claim in addition. It was not served on the government entities or the government parties that were concerned. And yet the plaintiffs went for default judgment. And when they went for default judgment and the judgment was being enforced, where the government entity saw it for the first time, the government entity entered appearance and sought to set aside the process, which the trial judge refused, dismissed the government entity's processes application. I don't think that this was a case of lack of expertise, for example, that the legal profession doesn't know that when a process is filed and not served, the plaintiff is not entitled to judgment in default of appearance and all of that. There were also clear issues of where it was just really public servants and civil servants being negligent. It wasn't an issue of capacity. There were several cases in the same report, for example, that the case was served on the Attorney General's department, and the particular officer in charge of the prosecution of the case doesn't defend it. The case is not defended. So it wasn't an issue that they didn't have the capacity or the expertise to defend it. It's just that they didn't do it. So very largely, and why didn't they do it? What consequences followed? So we have to start considering surcharges, recoveries, dismissal, and prosecution. We have to go back to the terms of engagement of public servants and civil servants. It's not just the politicians in this case. At least when something falls in the line of role for a public servant to do, and they don't do it, there should be consequences. In terms of the management of the contracts, for example, it's still the same thing. A lot of the time, it's really not an expertise issue. It's just because, I mean, you can get away with it. For example, you have the Lands Commission that is in charge of a lot of issues concerning land. We have a state land act which provides the formula for what should be done when. It's not very complicated. There's a lot of expertise within the government setup to guide this. Do they do it? Look at the report. No, they don't. Sometimes, for example, that a payment should have been made into an escrow account, for example, it's not made, or payments are made to wrong families. So to a large extent, yes, when it comes to capacity issues, there are other sides that need a capacity, but the executive from where I sit is not one of them. That said, of course, when we're talking about the parliamentary issues and fixing parliament, of course, we were talking about it in respect of the agreements that must go to parliament and under the constitution. Not all agreements go to parliament, but the constitution prescribes some agreements that must go to parliament. So we're talking in reference to those ones, and whether in that situation, parliament is able to do us the justice that otherwise could have been done. It's good to know that this is being addressed. And my other thing is just to the political parties here, that yes, I agree that, of course, if you are popular in your area, you contest and win. But once if the political parties that have representation in parliament must consider their own internal processes and internal even building expertise within their political parties, so that at least they are able to identify certain members that they can send that they can get to contest and win into to parliament, so who have particular kinds of expertise that they would bring to benefit the service of parliament, whether it's committees or even just scrutinizing a lot of the work. So it will help all of us if political parties begin, at least even right from their own internal processes, to deal with, to try to see how they can attract and build capacity in terms of some of the people that, not all, but at least you should have some people in some key areas that you can sponsor to parliament to do a certain job that would effectively benefit parliament. And then generally we should all be involved in education of the people, because I've always said that let's also sometimes put ourselves in the shoes of the MP. When you are contesting, what is a lot of the time, what is most important to your constituencies, freebies that you can give. So donations that you can give, school fees that you can pay, hospital bills. When they have outdooring marriages, they want you to give money. You promise all kinds of things that come with that you require money to do. Where does the MP get the money to do that? If the MP focuses on doing their job as an MP and they don't sometimes need to make deals to get money to be able to at least secure their seat in the first place, we are going to have some of these things. So we probably all also need to get involved in educating people so that cultural aspect of the kinds of wanting freebies from politicians we can do away with. Because I always say that politicians are not going to go and disinvest their pension funds, for example, and come and give it freely to constituents. So where do we think they get the money from? So there is that, and like largely it's an entire value chain issue. But I think if we begin to fix it from the issue of accountability, making sure that specific officers responsible for specific things, if they are negligent, even if you do your work wrongly and you are not negligent, if you are incompetent, of course you should lose your job. So if they display, gross incompetence or negligence in the way they carry out, and it results in financial loss to the state, there is no reason why, because they are public servants or civil servants, they should not be held accountable. Yeah. And this cuts across, including the district assemblies, the MMDAs and all of that, and including the state. We didn't get time to talk about the way government relates with state enterprises, but that would be for another time. So for my concluding remarks, this is what I will say. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Clara. Yeah, I mean, I think the emphasis on accountability, I think, is an important one. Dr. Kwapon.
Very much. At the end of the day, these judgment debts, I don't know how many of you have looked on the side of private side in Ghana. So if you go to the private side in Ghana and you look at the court cases and the companies involved, you would notice that there's a lot of judgment debt-like litigation that goes on. So what is happening on the private side, is basically what we've also seen on the government side. There's just a lot of litigation, a lot of bad agreements and non-compliance that always result in going to court. Politicians are not going away. We elect them. Interest people's interest and all these interests that people have are not going away. So we have to live with it. So at the end of the day, I'll refer back to what Prof said about the process and the structure. But what I will only caution us to do is this. A lot of countries have systems that are best practices. They do a good job managing international contracts. We don't have to reinvent the ways that we do our processes, because what happens is if we do it best practice, then it gives a bit of expected outcomes to those who actually engage us. When we are chaotic, then those who engage us, who come in, then also see a reason to take advantage of us. So I will actually advise that we take a hard look at some of the countries that are comparable to us, like Peru, Botswana, and take a hard look at how they manage these risks. And I will say this, if we had an institution that owned the process, much like the PPA is supposed to own the procurement process, and that institution actually was capable of doing contract management, valuation, and engaging with everybody else who wants to actually engage in the process in one place, that would be incredibly useful towards making it a bit more efficient. And then the second recommendation I'll have is this, and I mentioned this before. The Attorney General's office is capable of actually putting in a process that engages private legal firms and technical people every time something comes in front of them across their desk. However, if there was a center of excellence that actually managed all these contracts, then it makes the job of the Attorney General actually even much easier, because much like it engages with the PPA on procurements and makes sure that PPA is on hook for that, there'll be another agency. On the executive side, there's already a process. You know, I've gone before the Economic Development Committee, you know, a lot of things go in front of them and it gets discussed. And a lot of technical people are invited to go there and get discussed. What is missing is the place where contracts actually get managed. They actually get sort of work through and make sure that you know, civil societies can actually engage with one entity and not just sort of searching for who's doing this, so we can sort of get in a room. You know, this whole thing about, okay, let's go to Royal Senchi and sit down and talk through something is too chaotic, you know. And I think the two recommendations I'll just make is this. Let's see how we can foster an institution, much like the PPA, to be in the middle, but it has to have a capability to actually manage contracts, capability to actually do valuations such that it can actually alert people on sort of the money at sort of at issue when court cases are happening, and a place where the Attorney General's office can actually engage with wholly, bringing in external private entities, law firms, and civil societies all in one place to really work on these things.
All right.
Because that's how a lot of the countries that I have worked in and I have sort of engaged with have done it and have done it successfully. There's no, if you try to manage this sort of independently, the risks are too much. You know, the politicians will always be there. You know, we have a strong president. Well, so does the US. Donald Trump wanted to do a whole lot of things, right? But the OMB did not let him, because when the OMB evaluated it and said, hey, this is the outcomes and whatnot, then everybody, the CSOs and everybody got the data they needed and pushed back, right? We need stuff like that. And then the last piece I will sort of add, because I'm in part of CDD, is we as CDD actually have to do a better job at actually, every time an issue like that come out, putting out a comprehensive end-to-end viewpoint, well done, and always sort of give enough to the public and everybody else to really litigate whatever issue that comes into the public face. So I think that the last piece, I'll just say, you know, to Prof, that some of these technical pieces that usually the public does not have the capability, we have to do a better job of basically working on it and putting it out there. Right.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Kapon. Mr. Fosudote, and then Dr. Graham.
Okay, thank you. I have a few points for recommendation going forward. One has to do with the AG's office. I mean, Honorable Deputy AG said, yeah, they do rely on external consultants, etc. One recommendation I will make, and I've made it before, I don't think it's been fully implemented, is for the AG's office to decentralize the civil division and get the lawyers to actually be in the MDAs and the MMDAs, so that they can and I recommend they have monthly reports to the AG. Monthly reports, and it's not, I'm talking about monthly reports written long legalese and prose that nobody may read. I mean, there are simple formats for these things that can identify red flags during the process, so that the AG is alerted, and AG then can alert the system ahead of time, so that they don't wait until the thing comes to their knowledge. Properly organized AG starts at the decentralized level, not when the thing gets to the AG's center where it's too late. So that's one. And still on the AG, the recommendation, I think it is important that on projects which come to them, it's not a question of just opinion, but letting, especially experts who understand this, come to present to them what the risk matrix is. I mean, we do risk matrix analysis every day. Last week, I helped one government agency negotiate a project where essentially we turn it upside down just by doing analysis of the risk matrix. Because the risk matrix can tell you right from the beginning whether you're heading for trouble or not. So that it's not a question of a document has come to you, but what is the document leading to? Is it going to lead to trouble or not? So that's recommendation number one for the AGs. The second one, incidentally, comes to CDD, and I think the previous speaker mentioned something like that. I think there's a difference between judgment debt, which occurs as a result of procurement processes and contract administrations, etc., as distinct from where the system is shortchanged by some either extractive industry or some other, which may not necessarily lead to judgment debt. What I was talking about does not necessarily lead to judgment debt, but we are shortchanged. So we should distinguish that, and this judgment debt thing should be drilled down properly as judgment debt and where it emanates, whether it's from extractive industry, whether it's from infrastructure, whether from other finance agreements, etc. The third one, which I think Professor Prempe has already, we need model agreements. Any country where it is sold, develop model agreements in sectors. We do have it in the oil and gas sector. But even with the model agreements, you find that some of the clauses, apart from the stability clauses, you find that even at times, when it comes to negotiating, people try to modify the model in order to seal the situation and create problems. But at least we do have the model. Then you can use that as a yardstick. And there are various sectors for which you can easily develop models. I mean, I did a paper for the International Bar Association on negotiating with bullies, negotiating with entities which refuse to negotiate. That was the title of the paper, and I mean, and it attracted quite a lot of attention. You have a situation where in countries, and in Africa, can cite South Africa. If you are doing a housing deal in South Africa, there are some clauses which are non-negotiable. They've done it over and over again. They know what they will not negotiate. In Ghana, everything is up for negotiation. It cannot be. There are certain things we know we cannot do, and once we have model contracts and we say clause X, Y, Z are non-negotiable, the civil servant goes into the room knowing he cannot negotiate. It doesn't matter which politician is breathing down his neck. These are non-negotiable. So I will recommend that. And then fourth, I will recommend a massive public education, or sorry, not a public education, a massive education on the public sector persons who administer contracts, the MMDAs, the MDAs. Because no matter how bad the contract is, how you administer it can create a judgment debt. I said not every bad deal results in judgment debt. At times, it's the way we administer the contract. Let me just give you an example. I was once asked to give a second opinion on a project where there was a claim of 18 million pounds and 200,000 Ghana cedis. That was the claim. The claim had been approved. It had been approved by the public sector. It did have been approved by everybody who matters. It just happens that the minister was going to go ahead and recommend to the Minister of Finance, and he said, can I get a second opinion? And somebody just mentioned my name. And when I did an assessment, and there's a way to analyze a contract, I said, this person is qualified for only 200,000 pounds and the 200,000 Ghana cedis. The contractor accepted it without question. In other words, 17.8 million pounds was going to go just like that because somebody didn't analyze it very well. If you have a situation where public servants are well educated on this, and in documentation, I represent the government on one occasion where the party on the other side said, oh, but you government people, you don't have documentation. And it happens because what may look to a lawyer as a document which can save us is thrown, and they don't even submit it to Attorney General who is defending us. So again, education on how to manage contracts, how to minimize is something that we need to do. Then the political part, the political pressure, I think we need to educate the political class also. Yes, you want to deliver your promise, but does the agreement have to go at the last minute, which we've talked about? I mean, experience, you can check this. If the agreements get to parliament, the closer it is, it gets to when they are rising, the more likely is it to go through. It's because at the very last minute, there is that pressure. It's like the story is told about one Francophone country where the president at that time makes sure all important decisions are made between 11:30 and 12 o'clock. So he starts with all the useless cases, and then when he comes to make major decisions at cabinet, at 11:45, he tables it, and everybody says, d'accord, d'accord, because they must go for lunch. So naturally, if you bring it at the very last minute, when Parliament wants to rise, they are sitting at 2 a.m., the level of scrutiny may not be. So if they do make the new orders, right, as Honorable Kojo Ponkroma said, I think this will help. Then the last one has to do with, again, that is Attorney General, but a general education on the dispute resolution clause is one major reason we have the judgment debt. Now, In 2013 or so, I had the privilege to, 2011, 2012, I had the privilege to help draft the now Act 1039, the PPP Act. One of the consequential recommendations we made is that as a general rule for infrastructure, so far as the contract is in Ghana, the applicable law should be Ghana. That except for the finance or lending agreement, which we know if you are borrowing the money from outside, the lenders will not accept Ghanaian law. So we understand that. But I'm telling you, I still know of contracts which is Ghana, the money is Ghana, everything, but the MMDAs and MDAs are using English law because it just happens that the contractor had to be a foreign contractor. That should not determine. There is a principle in law called the center of gravity principle. The country to which the project is most associated should be the governing law, because a lot of the mistakes we make, I'm not saying we should make mistakes and get away with it, but a lot of the mistakes we make are carefully engineered by claim specialists and the rest who know that this will lead to an eventual judgment debt, and I will get a ruling if I go to some other jurisdiction. So I think a lot of emphasis should be on the applicable law, because we lose even before we start the contract. I mean, these are my recommendations. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
You know, when you're on a panel, you have to pay attention to where people are at in terms of attention. I mean, I'm not going to add a whole lot, but just some specific things again. I mean, I've chosen to focus on the strategy because they're not spectacular, unless it's, say, a Japa or Eka Energy and stuff like that. But there's a hemorrhage. Once an agreement goes through, it's a continuing hemorrhage, which is not like the big bang of a judgment debt which you pay, okay? So, and because this is also the most important source of public revenue in this period, and also potentially a very important source, not simply of revenue, but also development. Because the thing about extractives has moved on from revenue to development, okay? The concern about local content in oil, for example, is an example of that, okay? And I mean, there are frameworks like the ECOWAS Mineral Development Policy that we signed up to, the African Mining Vision, which have some clear things about the public development framework that should inform the kinds of extractive agreements that we sign. Because at the end of the day, even the amount of revenue you get depends on the value you give to your own resources. So just as a general thing. And I think that we have the sacred cow status of the foreign investor in our extractive sector ideology. It has all kinds of consequences. What we are ready to give away in exchange for getting some revenue. And I think moving from that must be a conscious thing of the evolution of our public institutions. Because the Minerals Commission, for example, sees itself still very much as an investment attracting entity, rather than an entity for optimizing the development benefits that we get from our minerals. Two completely different things. So where, for example, they could encourage small-scale local producers, they'll kick them off the land and give the thing to a foreign investor. Now, we may not see that as a loss, but if you see the multiplier consequences of a foreign company taking all the resources out, as opposed to local people who tend to accumulate internally with linkages in terms of job creation and so on, then, so I think that kind of framework is important. But when we come to the specifics, I think also that there are the issue of discretion. There are some key areas where really, talking about model laws and so on, the flip side of prescriptive regimes is what you choose to limit discretion on and what is not negotiable. And at the moment, experience has shown, and I don't want to go to the list, in both the oil and gas and mining sector, there are some areas of discretion really that should be tightened up. So there's a thing, for example, which says that if you invest 500 million, you get certain incentives. Now, there's no valuation put on what the 500 million should deliver to us. There's no criteria for what you should be doing with the 500, and yet people get all kinds of benefits. So the model law thing, it's another dimension is what is prescribed in detail, what is non-negotiable, and what is the limit to the excess of discretion. I mean, I'm not saying excess of discretion because what we have had is that discretion has been exercised, has been limited primarily in favor of the foreign investor as part of, again, this foreign investment attraction logic. When discretion should be limited in defense of our interests. So there are some things to flip around. And then I think the thing about access to information, the role of Parliament, I support the thing about, say, ending this institutionalized waiver of the 48-hour rule. I mean, it leads to ridiculous consequences in terms of there not being a proper discussion because people want to rush things through. A dimension of that, therefore, is that if Parliament is a representative of the people, they should also institutionalize within the kind of time frame for consideration serious mechanisms for engaging with any interested party. I mean, this is how expertise is also brought on board. So people can go and present detailed papers, the kind of amicus curiae type thing that I might do in a court case. Present a detailed thing and talk to the MPs. It's too informalized at the moment. It should be institutionalized so that, in a way, there's a way of weighing the choices that Parliament is making. A necessary corollary of that, of course, is the access to information. The minister spoke about things improving. But, you know, I mean, things improving, you can be using a moving bar, or we can say that where we are now is inadequate, and therefore we need to make progress. And I think the spirit of this discussion is that whatever progress we are making, and if you go outside Ghana, you speak to many non-Ghanaians, they say, Ghana, you have democracy. And they say, you know, we have this process. You don't know. They tell you don't know your own country. You know, because maybe they're comparing you to, you know, their own country, and they look at you. And my response is that, you know what? True, the Ghanaian floor is higher than yours. But for all of us, the ceiling is too low. So we need to have that perspective. And the access to information and the access to institutions, not simply in terms of the right to information, but, you know, a culture of our institutions. There's a clause in the Constitution I like to refer to, and since the Deputy AG is here, actually it's one of the injunctions placed on the government to do. Article 37(2) talks about the need for the state to pass laws that facilitate people's ability to participate in the development process. Access to information, being able to mobilize resources. I mean, Kojo Oponkrumah spoke about people pay attention to the assemblies. Imagine if there were these laws which were very clear in terms of that facilitatory function, so that from the district assembly upwards, they build a directory, for example, of groups interested in different issues. If you go to any ministry now, none of them have any systematic directory or groups interested in the areas of their focus. I mean, it's elementary. If they did that, actually the dynamic engagement between state and society will be enhanced. And people also, it will have a kind of effect of people seeing that actually it is possible to engage with public institutions and have that access. Because if Kojo, Kwesi, or myself, we can pick the phone and call even ministers. They say, oh, yeah, what is it? I said, you know, this agreement that was signed yesterday. Also, you want a copy? Send somebody to pick it. Somebody from the village where that mining project is taking place, they can trek to Accra. Forget it. So these things all affect the accountability, you know, mechanism. Thank you.
You have the last word.
Okay, so thanks for all of those very enlightening contributions, with which I think I associate almost universally. But let me take up the elephant in the room in my first comment. So the presidency, there is in the Constitution, well, maybe this is only maybe applicable to, say, land and natural resources, but there's an explicit statement in the Constitution that the president basically holds or manages these assets for us as a trustee, essentially as a fiduciary, right? Everywhere else, if a fiduciary obligation were imposed on somebody, there are really very significant obligations that flow out of it. I do not know yet, in the Ghanaian context, what we have made of that constitutional provision saying that the president holds certain assets for us as trustee for the people of Ghana. And I think where I would begin here is to breathe some life into that provision. I think we need some statutory explication of exactly what that entails in terms of whether it means giving us some model contracts to tell us this is our national interest should look like this in the contract. One, a certain reporting regime. Two, some very specific obligations that arise out of that very significant provision. We like to normally refer to the equivalent provision about chiefs. They are also mentioned as fiduciaries in the Constitution. But nobody touches the president's fiduciary role, which is also very explicit in the Constitution. So for me, I've always wondered, what does it mean in practice for the president to be a trustee of these resources for the people of Ghana? It appears that we are law shy when it comes to attaching obligations to the president. Maybe we go to the next level, not even to his ministers. I mean, maybe we go to the ministers a little bit in terms of statutory obligations, but we attach almost no statutory obligation to the presidency. And yet the Constitution names that person specifically as the one who is the trustee for us on these matters. So I think I would want to have some statutory explication of exactly what that fiduciary obligation means when it comes to the use and management of our public resources. A second area where, and I understand this whole Article 181 not covering the whole universe of contracts and all of that. And as the Supreme Court has read it with respect to, say, state-owned enterprises. But it does not disable Parliament, and for that matter, government, from imposing a statutory regime that binds SOEs and MMDAs. If we believe that that is also another major source of hemorrhaging, the fact that the Constitution does not extend its arm to those entities doesn't mean that we cannot, by statute, rein them in and maybe define a certain threshold in terms of amount. So if a certain contract is of this amount, that GMPC cannot do it without going through Parliament. And we should do that. We need to close that gap because that ruling essentially has been read by some to mean, oh, as long as you funnel it through a state-owned enterprise, it's good to go. We don't have to have oversight over it in Parliament, and therefore it doesn't come to the public space for scrutiny. I think that is not acceptable because many of these non-sovereign state-owned entities are actually really doing huge deals that directly affect the public interest, and we must have a say-so in how those things are managed. I'm very happy with the response from our Honorable Minister of Information, his support for this idea that the standing orders of Parliament must disallow certain kinds of transactions from being rushed through the parliamentary process. I think definitely standing orders is the best way to go. I mean, we should definitely not allow certificate of urgency or whatever they call emergency or whatever to be used to really push these transactions through. It's just not, it's just bad faith, it's improper, we shouldn't allow it. And then, this whole area of breaches. I think we have a very cavalier attitude about breaching contracts. I had a friend, a professor, law professor friend in the US once who called me. I think he had been selected to sit on an arbitral panel by Ghana, actually. And then once he reviewed the matter, he says, but is that how your people behave? This looks really very cavalier, very, very just reckless stuff, the way we went about breaching this contract. And maybe where we learned that from is the way we treat our own local contractors who do business with government. It's very abusive relationship, hugely abusive. So these habits are formed here. We treat local contractors like, oh, because you need the money, we can give it to you anytime you want, no interest, we even reduce the amount after the fact. We abuse them, and they don't say anything. Most of them say nothing. You know, they just put up with it because they don't want to be blacklisted politically. They want to come and do repeat business. And then once we have created these habits, very bad habits, ways of dealing with our own local entrepreneurs, we think we can extend it to any foreign contractor. No, they won't take it, right? But that is where the habits are formed. And I think that if we really want to change in terms of behavior modification, we should look at how the state treats Ghanaian contractors when it comes to contracts. It's terrible, absolutely. They won't tell you. I mean, these contractors, you ask them, Chaleba, why don't you sue? Oh, hey, do you want me to be, I don't want trouble. So they have taken this behavior and internationalized it. And there people won't put up with that nonsense, right? So they don't put up with it. And they will sue us. You know, no, they will not put up with it. So I think that that culture, this way of dealing with our own, is really where we have formed these bad habits. And I also think in respect of that, with respect to that, a contract that has already been approved, I think there has to be a certain safeguard against very cavalier breaches, right? Some breaches are in the law and in economics efficient. So you make a deal, and at the time of performance, the circumstances have changed so radically that you are better off not performing than performing. Of course, there's a reputational risk when you do that too often, but sometimes it makes economic sense actually to say, Charlie, this deal, the thing has changed so much, the price, things have changed so much that we are better off actually not going ahead. Those situations, I think, may be few and far between, you know, but for the most part, it should not be that easy for us to breach a contract commitment we have already made. It's too cavalier the way we do it. And maybe, I don't know if we have to find another process. If Parliament has approved it and you want to breach it, maybe you go back and you get approval by a supermajority. I don't know. But something needs to be put in place so that we don't take our international commitments this cavalierly. Because apart from the money cost, there's a real reputational damage to the country. You know, when people don't trust your word as a country, they put a premium. When they do business with you, you pay a premium. Every contract that somebody will pay 5 cedis for, you are paying 100 cedis. And they say, oh, Ghana, you have to charge them 100 cedis because they will dilly-dally and breach. So we don't, there's no free lunch. This behavior is costing us not just in monetary terms, it's costing us reputationally, and it gets back to us in the premium that we pay on our contract prices for these kinds of deals. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. I know we've taken a lot of your time, but you know, this is, I still think it's a conversation starter because there's just too many things to grapple with. But as I said, we want to get a product out of this, which will be some sort of a discussion document that we can then use to continue the conversation, engage the AG, other institutions, and see if we can really get some of these recommendations that have been, which I think at least will begin to get to the heart of the problem, you know, moving. So I'm not going to say much, just to thank all of you for being, and those who've been watching on YouTube as well, for continuing to join us, and to thank the Deputy Attorney General for coming, to thank our panelists, Mr. Fusudote. I don't know these days how much you charge by the hour. So I know there's a lot of money that you have put. That's your contribution to So thank you, Dr. Graham. Thank you, Dr. Kwapon, for it was very short notice, but you joined us, and I'm really grateful that you joined us thank you for your insights. And Clara, also thank you very much for your contributions. to come your way again. You know, do have a good rest of the day.